Tonight, we follow the rise of a man born in smoke and ambition, a soldier who dreamed not of medals, but of maps. His boots trampled kings, his mind redrew borders, yet even in exile, his name moved armies. This is not the tale of a conqueror, it is the shadow he left behind. Before we begin, if stories like this bring you comfort, then like this video and subscribe. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time is now. Now, dim the lights, steady your breath, and let's begin. The island of Corsica had not yet accepted its fate when Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world. It was August 15th, 1769, barely 15 months since the French had taken control from the native Corsican resistance. The takeover had not been clean. It had been forced, loud, bitter, and sudden. Corsicans still wore their grief like a second skin. Their flag had fallen, their leaders exiled, but their anger lived on in hushed conversations and clenched jaws. Into this smoldering silence, into a nation still wounded, a child was born. His family was not poor by Corsican standards, but they were not powerful either. The Bonapartes carried minor noble blood, which meant little on an island where nobility had no empire left to guard. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, had been a follower of the revolutionary Pasquale Paoli, a man Corsicans still whispered about like a prophet in exile. But after the fall, Carlo swore loyalty to the French, trading principle for position. He accepted a government post. He sent his children to French schools. He made peace with the new rulers. Not everyone forgave him, not even his son. Napoleon grew up in the space between two identities, Corsican by blood, French by force. He spoke Italian at home and learned French with difficulty, carrying a thick accent that would follow him all his life. His name, Napoleone di Buonaparte, sounded foreign to Parisians. They would mock it, try to twist it into something more elegant, more acceptable, but he would never fully erase the edges. The outsider status that once shamed him became his armor. He would turn difference into dominance. Even as a child, he did not laugh easily. He studied others with the same intensity he later brought to military maps. While other boys played, he calculated. He observed everything: tone, gesture, silence. His mother, Letizia, was a hard woman shaped by war. She ruled the household with unbending structure and moral discipline. Napoleon adored her. She was the first person he admired, the first model of power he ever knew. He would later say, "It is to my mother that I owe my fortune and all my education." Carlo, his father, was more charming than strong. He died when Napoleon was 15. By then, the boy had already decided the world would not pity him. Napoleon's early education was in Ajaccio, but through his father's connections with the French authorities, he won a scholarship to a military academy in Brienne-le-Château in mainland France. The transition was brutal. The weather was cold, the students colder. He was mocked for his accent, his manners, his thin clothing. He was shorter than many of the other boys. He was poorer, he was different, but he endured. It was at Brienne that the boy began to forge a discipline deeper than emotion. He retreated into books, especially history. He devoured accounts of Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Hannibal. He copied maps not just to memorize them, but to mentally rearrange them. He didn't just want to learn what had been done. He wanted to imagine what could have been done differently. His obsession with strategy was born not from patriotism or tradition, but from the realization that in war, intellect could overcome birthright. By the time he graduated and entered the École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon was known among instructors for his brilliance in mathematics and artillery. He was quiet, often withdrawn, but his mind was sharp and relentless. He was not popular. He did not seek to be. He once said, "I care only for people who can be useful to me and only when I need them." Even as a teenager, he had a politician's patience and a general's detachment. France itself was beginning to fracture. The monarchy stood on brittle foundations. Poverty was rising. Whispers of revolution circled through salons and slums. Napoleon watched it all with cold interest. He had no loyalty to kings. He had no illusions about justice. What fascinated him was power. Who had it, how they kept it, and how they lost it. At 20, Napoleon became a second lieutenant in the French army, stationed in Valence. He spent more time reading than drinking. His letters from this time are full of philosophy, frustration, and isolation. He hated mediocrity, loathed laziness, and saw weakness as a kind of disease. He believed the world owed him nothing, and yet he expected to claim everything. There was no prophecy carved into stone that named him a future emperor. He wasn't a chosen one. He was a watcher, a listener, a reader, and beneath his quiet surface, a storm was building. France would soon tear itself apart in the fires of the revolution. The monarchy would fall. Old generals would lose their heads. The army would fracture, reform, and fracture again. And in the chaos that followed, the boy from Corsica, mocked for his accent, doubted for his origins, would begin his rise. He would not arrive with fanfare. He would not ask permission, but with each step, each command, each strategic silence, Napoleon Bonaparte would move closer to a truth he already knew, that Europe had forgotten how to fear a single man, and he was about to remind them. When Napoleon entered Brienne-le-Château, it wasn't the France he would one day command. Not yet. This France was still a monarchy, still rigid, still ruled by class and coin. And for a young Corsican boy sent into the heart of its aristocratic academy, the world must have felt colder than the stone floors he slept on. He arrived at Brienne at the age of 9, a scholarship student with more questions than confidence. His French was awkward, his clothes were simple, his manners were blunt. To the sons of noblemen, he was an outsider, and they treated him like one. They mocked his name, called him provincial, laughed at the sharp Corsican vowels in his speech, but even then, he didn't retaliate with emotion. He retaliated by remembering. He watched how boys formed alliances, how teachers played favorites. He noticed how sense made the powerful uncomfortable. He began to shape himself not in response to cruelty, but in contrast to it. He wouldn't become like them. He would become something they couldn't ignore. What he lacked in wealth or fluency, he compensated for with brilliance. Mathematics became his sanctuary. Geometry, physics, and especially artillery, the science of war, came easily to him. Where others saw complicated formulas, he saw possibilities. Where they saw maps, he saw outcomes. He began to spend his nights reading about Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar, not just as heroes, but as case studies. What had they risked? What had they sacrificed? What had they gotten wrong? It wasn't glory that fascinated him. It was the balance between ambition and discipline. In the margins of his notebooks, he sketched military formations. He wrote essays about the rise and fall of empires. His imagination was already fighting wars no one else could see. Despite his detachment, there were teachers who recognized his mind. One, impressed by his strategic analysis of Caesar's campaigns, wrote in his report, "This boy's ambition knows no limit." Others noted his cold temper, his refusal to engage in idle gossip, and his distant, calculated demeanor. He was serious, unnervingly so. While others chased approval, Napoleon chased understanding. At 14, he wrote an essay entitled "A History of Corsica," defending the island's fight for independence and denouncing French oppression. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't safe, it was deeply personal, and yet it was also strategic. Even then, he used history as both sword and shield, revealing just enough to provoke, but not enough to be punished. By the time he transferred to the École Militaire in Paris at age 15, his path was narrowing. He had chosen artillery, not the most glamorous branch, but the most exacting. It required intellect, precision, and patience. Napoleon saw it as a form of control. With artillery, one could reshape the battlefield without ever stepping into it. It was the weapon of those who planned 3 moves ahead. But even at this prestigious military academy, his Corsican roots followed him. He was still mocked, still excluded from elite circles. He wore his uniform with purpose, but not pride. He saved every franc he could. He lived on cheap bread and sour wine, while others danced in salons. He walked along the Seine with old books under his arm, muttering calculations to himself. Then tragedy struck. His father, Carlo, died of stomach cancer in 1785, leaving the family with debt and uncertainty. At just 16, Napoleon had to grow up quickly. He graduated from the École Militaire early, compressed his officer's training from 2 years into 1, and earned a commission as a second lieutenant in the Lafayette Artillery Regiment. He was now a soldier, but one with no command, no fortune, and no name that Paris respected. His first postings were modest. Small towns, aging garrisons, endless drills, but he kept reading, he kept writing. He absorbed every tactic, every precedent, every error from military history, and all the while, France was beginning to tremble. By the late 1780s, the cracks in the monarchy were becoming impossible to ignore. Bread was scarce, taxes were high, nobles were hated, and across the countryside, the word revolution passed from mouth to mouth like a match searching for tinder. Napoleon watched quietly. He wasn't a revolutionary in the traditional sense. He didn't shout slogans or storm buildings, but he understood instinctively that the world was about to shift. And when it did, those who were prepared would rise. In 1789, the Bastille fell, the revolution began, the monarchy unraveled, and the old generals, once secure in titles and bloodlines, began to vanish. Some were killed, others fled. The army splintered, positions opened, battles loomed. Napoleon, now in his early 20s, saw opportunity, not for vanity, but for motion. He returned briefly to Corsica, hoping to support the nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. But that hope soured. Paoli didn't trust Napoleon's French connections. Accusations of betrayal flew. Fights broke out. Eventually, the Bonapartes were driven from Corsica altogether, branded as traitors. For Napoleon, it was more than exile. It was a severing. He would never again identify as Corsican. From this point forward, he would be French, fiercely, relentlessly French. In 1793, he caught his first real break at Toulon, a port seized by royalist forces and British allies. The French army struggled to retake it. Napoleon, though still young and untested, proposed an artillery plan so effective that it turned the tide of the battle. The city fell, the British withdrew, and Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. He had arrived, not fully, not finally, but the soldier the world had mocked was now a general, not because of family or luck or inheritance, but because in the quiet halls of Brienne, in the lonely streets of Paris, he had studied what others ignored, and now his silence had become his strength. There were still many wars to fight, many crowns to challenge, but in these early years, when the smoke of revolution mixed with the cold calculation of a rising mind, a shadow had begun to stretch across Europe, and the world had not yet realized how far it would reach. Paris was burning, not with flames, but with fear, suspicion, and the kind of rage that doesn't need fire to destroy. The French Revolution, once a spark of hope, had evolved into something darker, more hungry, more unstable. In the streets, people spoke with lowered voices. In government chambers, alliances crumbled overnight. The king had fallen. The old order was gone, but no one quite knew what would replace it. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this chaos was not a warning, it was an invitation. He was 24, recently promoted, restless. The victory at Toulon had placed him on the map, not just as a capable officer, but as a man willing to act without hesitation. He had shown France that artillery was not just a support force, it could be decisive, and that he, though young and unconnected, could be trusted when the stakes were high. But trust was not a currency in revolutionary France. Survival was. In 1794, the revolution reached its fever pitch. Robespierre ruled with ideals and guillotines. Paranoia swept the capital. Enemies of the state were named and executed within days, sometimes hours. Napoleon, briefly suspected of being too close to certain Jacobin leaders, was arrested. For weeks, he sat in a cell waiting to learn whether his loyalty would be questioned or erased. But his name was not called. His file was buried, and he walked free. Many officers, having faced such a brush with death, would have retreated, chosen caution, diplomacy, or retirement. Not Napoleon. If anything, the near-death silence deepened his sense of purpose. He had survived the revolution's madness. That to him felt like proof. The world still had work for him to do. By 1795, the revolutionary government, now the Directory, was barely holding together. Royalists were emboldened. Uprisings erupted. In October, a massive counter-revolutionary mob gathered to overthrow the regime in Paris. The government panicked. They needed someone who would act decisively, ruthlessly, and without ceremony. They called Napoleon. He didn't wait. He didn't deliberate. He ordered cannons into position around the Tuileries Palace. He had them loaded with grape shot, short-range ammunition that turned the barrels into giant shotguns. And when the mob approached, he gave the command. The streets exploded. The crowd didn't stand a chance. Hundreds were wounded. Dozens were killed. The uprising collapsed within hours. Paris was silenced, not by speeches, but by steel. Later, people would call it the whiff of grape shot. But it was more than that. It was a message. The revolution had devoured kings. It had guillotined generals. But Napoleon Bonaparte had shown it could also be tamed. The Directory rewarded him with command of the Army of the Interior. He was given power, resources, and something he had never had before: political weight. France, desperate for order, began to see him not just as a soldier, but as a solution. He didn't waste time. He studied the corruption within the government. He noted the weaknesses in its military structure. He memorized the mood of the people. While others traded favors and chased popularity, he kept building, quietly, systematically. He strengthened his alliances. He expanded his network. He became indispensable. That same year, he met a woman who would change his course again, Josephine de Beauharnais. She was elegant, older, charming, and recently widowed. Her husband had died in the revolution. She moved through salons and political circles with ease. She had what Napoleon lacked: grace, social presence, and influence. He fell for her quickly, though it's unclear if she ever truly returned his passion. She was cautious, strategic, but she saw something in him, something the rest of France was just beginning to notice. They married in March 1796. 2 days later, he left for war. The Italian campaign was his next assignment. France needed victories. The country was surrounded by enemies. Austria, in particular, was pressing hard. Napoleon was sent to command a struggling French army in northern Italy. They were underfed, underpaid, and uninspired. He transformed them. In speeches, he appealed not to patriotism, but to glory. "You are naked and ill-fed," he told them, "yet rich provinces and great cities lie within your reach." He promised loot, medals, honor, and then delivered. In just a year, he crushed the Austrians in a series of rapid, brutal campaigns. He forced them to the negotiation table. He captured Milan, took Venice, and redrew the map of northern Italy. And everywhere he went, he moved not just like a general, but like a ruler. He negotiated treaties directly, installed client republics, sent statues and treasures back to France. His image appeared in paintings, his name filled the newspapers, and through it all, the Directory, meant to control him, grew increasingly uneasy. France had sent a soldier. What they got back was something else. Napoleon returned to Paris in 1797 as a hero. Crowds greeted him. Artists praised him. Politicians tried awkwardly to contain him. But how do you contain a man who had made kings tremble in less than a year? And he was not finished. The next campaign he proposed shocked everyone. Egypt, a land of myth, empire, and strategic positioning. Napoleon convinced the Directory that by seizing Egypt, France could weaken Britain, expand its influence in the East, and capture the imagination of Europe. They agreed, and so, barely catching his breath, Napoleon prepared once more to leave, not just to conquer, but to shape. Egypt, to him, was not only sand and secrets. It was the stage on which he would begin to transform from a French general into a global name. But in Paris, behind closed doors, whispers had already begun. Was this young soldier becoming too powerful? And if so, how long before he stopped taking orders altogether? In the spring of 1798, Napoleon stood on the shores of France, once again preparing to disappear, this time not into exile or prison, but into legend. The campaign he had conceived was unlike anything France had ever attempted. He would lead 35,000 men, dozens of ships, scientists, artists, and historians, all headed for Egypt, not just to conquer, but to illuminate. He told his generals, "We will carry the light of reason to a land of darkness." But what he didn't say, not out loud, was that he was also escaping a government that feared him, escaping a city that adored him too early, escaping the suffocating politics of a republic eating itself from the inside out. It was theater, and it worked, but not everything did. Soon after his arrival, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson caught the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. In one of the most devastating naval defeats in French history, Nelson annihilated Napoleon's ships. His army was now stranded in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, plagued by disease, and cut off from reinforcements. But Napoleon did not waver. Instead, he governed. He issued laws, reformed tax systems, established the Institut d'Egypte, bringing together artists and scholars to study ancient culture. He had scientists analyze the Nile, record hieroglyphs, document flora and fauna. One of his officers discovered the Rosetta Stone. In his mind, this campaign was more than war. It was a renaissance under cannon fire. Yet in the shadows, everything was crumbling. In France, the Republic was collapsing under its own contradictions. Corruption bloomed in every office. Inflation raged. Food was scarce. The people were exhausted by slogans. Revolution had promised liberty. What they got was a revolving door of leaders, bloodied and forgotten. And so Napoleon, from his desert exile, began writing home. His letters were careful, measured. He exaggerated his victories, downplayed his isolation, and sent copies to Le Moniteur, the official French newspaper. The headlines praised him. The people remembered him, and the Directory, already fragile, began to tremble. By 1799, Napoleon knew it was time. He left Egypt in secret, slipping past the British blockade, and landed in France to a city crumbling under disappointment. The Directory was deeply unpopular. The legislature was divided. There were food riots. Royalists whispered of a return to monarchy. Jacobins whispered of another purge. The revolution had devoured its children and now stood alone in the cold. Napoleon did not announce his return with parades. He met with a few loyal allies. Among them, Emmanuel Sieyès, a political theorist who believed the Republic needed restructuring. What he really meant was, it needed a strong hand. Together, they planned a coup. On November 9th, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon arrived at the chambers of the Council of 500. Chaos erupted. Some cried treason, others called for his arrest. One even lunged at him with a blade, but Napoleon remained steady. His brother Lucien, president of the council, declared that the assembly was under threat from radicals. Outside, troops loyal to Napoleon entered the hall and cleared the chamber. No blood was spilled. No vote was cast. And yet, the Republic fell. By the next morning, Napoleon Bonaparte was first consul of France. He was not a king, not yet, but he held all the power, legislative, executive, and military. He rewrote the Constitution, consolidated authority, banned dissent, and called it all a restoration of order. The French exhausted by years of violence and broken promises, accepted him. Some even cheered. In Napoleon, they saw something the revolution had failed to give them: stability. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a leader who seemed to rise not from bloodlines, but from brilliance. He promised peace, glory, justice, and bread, and for a time he delivered. He reformed the tax system, reopened churches, rebuilt schools, created the Bank of France, the Code Napoleon, his civil legal code, brought equality before the law, secular education, and clear property rights. It would go on to shape legal systems around the world. But beneath the calm, the shadow deepened. Napoleon began to silence newspapers, censor art, suppress political opposition. He filled his government with loyalists and expanded the secret police. Power, he had learned, was not protected by ideals, but by fear and surveillance. The revolution was over, but its ghost still wandered the streets, and Napoleon, now barely 30, had buried it with a pen, a sword, and the quiet conviction that the people would trade liberty for glory, so long as he could keep winning. He had conquered the Republic without firing a shot, but in his heart, the true crown still waited, and soon he would reach for it, not as a man of the people, but as the shadow of an empire rising. The desert does not give answers, it gives space, space for ambition to echo louder, and for truth to dissolve like water beneath the sun. When Napoleon returned to France in 1799, Egypt still clung to him, not just in memory, but in myth. To the public, he was the general who had ventured into the ancient land of pyramids and prophets, a modern Alexander, a French pharaoh. The truth, as always, was more fragile because Egypt had not gone as planned. When the campaign began in 1798, Napoleon had imagined a swift conquest and a dazzling victory over the British and their allies. But Egypt resisted in ways he hadn't expected. Disease spread, heat crushed morale. The local population, both Arab and Mamluk, remained largely uncooperative, and while Napoleon won battles, he could not conquer the silence that surrounded them. After the Battle of the Pyramids, he marched to Cairo in triumph. His soldiers saw the treasures of the city, the call to prayer echoing through unfamiliar streets, and the Nile glistening like a snake in sunlight. Napoleon tried to present himself as a liberator. He claimed to respect Islam. He ordered proclamations read in Arabic, declaring that he had come to break the chains of tyranny. But no one was fooled. The locals saw the invader clearly. His promises of justice meant little when weighed against cannon fire and foreign rule. Rebellions began to stir, and though crushed quickly, they revealed the truth. Napoleon had underestimated Egypt's soul. Still, he kept building the illusion. He brought with him a corps of scientists, over 150 savants, architects, geologists, linguists, tasked not with war, but with wonder. Together, they launched one of the most ambitious cultural missions in history. They recorded hieroglyphs, measured temples, catalogued animals and plants. They unearthed mysteries buried for centuries. In their hands, Napoleon's war became a kind of enlightenment, and for a moment, that illusion held. Then came the sea. The British Navy, under the ruthless, brilliant command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, found the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. On August 1st, 1798, they attacked with precision and fury. Within hours, the French ships were burning. Explosions lit the Egyptian coast. Masts splintered. Men drowned. The Orient, Napoleon's flagship, detonated in a fireball seen from miles away. When it was over, the Mediterranean belonged to Britain. Napoleon and his army were trapped. It was perhaps his first true defeat, and yet he never admitted it. In dispatches, he downplayed the loss. He called it unfortunate, a setback, but not failure. He rewrote the story as quickly as it had unfolded. This pattern, this ability to reshape perception, would follow him forever. Back in Cairo, rebellion sparked again. In October, the people rose in anger. French soldiers were killed in the streets. Mosques became barricades. Napoleon responded with fury. He bombarded the city, sent cavalry through narrow lanes, and executed leaders. The revolt was crushed, but the damage was deeper than ruins. Whatever illusion of liberation he had crafted, it was gone. And then there was Syria. In early 1799, Napoleon marched north, seeking to confront the Ottoman Empire's army before it could threaten his hold on Egypt. The campaign was brutal. He besieged Jaffa, a coastal city, and when it fell, thousands of captured defenders were executed. The reason was strategic. He couldn't feed or guard them, but the act stained his legacy. At Acre, he met resistance he could not break. The fortress held. Disease tore through his ranks. Dysentery, plague, starvation. His troops began to falter. His reputation did too. For the first time, whispers of weakness reached Europe. He returned to Egypt defeated, thinner, quieter, more deliberate, and then, without ceremony or announcement, he left. In August 1799, and Napoleon abandoned his army and sailed back to France. Some called it desertion. Others called it instinct. But he knew something the rest of the world did not. Back home, the directory was failing. An opportunity was calling. He left Egypt to General Kléber. Within a few years, most of the French gains would vanish. But the myth, that remained. The Description de l'Égypte, published years later, immortalized the campaign as a triumph of culture, science, and exploration. It would influence Europe's fascination with the East for generations. And Napoleon, though he lost ships and soldiers, returned to France not as a general who had failed, but as one who had dared. In his absence, he had grown. By the time his boots touched French soil again, he was no longer simply a soldier. He was the whisper behind every headline, the name on every street corner, the silhouette rising behind every speech. France, exhausted by revolution and uncertainty, looked to him not for more war, but for order, and he was ready to give it. With the coup of 18 Brumaire, he dismantled the Republic from the inside, became first consul, wrote a new constitution, promised peace, and for a moment it seemed he would deliver on all of it. But Egypt had changed him, not in loss, but in vision. He had seen what it meant to rule not just with armies, but with ideas, what it meant to paint conquest in the colors of civilization, what it meant to be both Caesar and Aristotle, general and philosopher. And deep within him, a new truth had crystallized. That power was not something you seized, it was something you shaped. The sands of Egypt had not crowned him, but they had taught him what it meant to stand alone between myth and empire, shadow and light. They wanted the strength, and Napoleon had returned not to follow orders, but to give them. He came back quietly, no parades, no proclamations, just movement, quiet meetings, short walks through narrow corridors, whispered conversations with men who were also watching the Republic collapse under its own contradictions. One of those men was Emmanuel Sieyès, a respected intellectual and one of the 5 directors. He was convinced the Constitution needed to be overhauled, but what he lacked was force. Napoleon was force. Sieyès believed he could control the young general. He thought Napoleon would be the sword, a temporary instrument of transition, but swords do not surrender once drawn, and Napoleon, with every passing hour, was drawing the map of a new France, one that didn't ask for approval, one that didn't need permission. The plan was simple, clean, surgical. On the 18th of Brumaire, year of 80 of the revolutionary calendar, November 9th, 1799, Napoleon would march into power not through bloodshed, but through choreography. Troops loyal to him surrounded the legislature at Saint-Cloud under the pretext of protecting it from a Jacobin plot. In reality, the plot was his own. Inside the chambers, the mood was electric. Some suspected treason, others welcomed salvation. Napoleon entered the Council of Ancients, gave a trembling, disorganized speech, and was met with applause and suspicion. But in the lower house, the Council of 500, it unraveled. He was heckled, accused, surrounded. A delegate lunged at him, and Napoleon stumbled, visibly shaken. It was his brother Lucien, president of the chamber, who saved the moment. Lucien drew his sword and declared that armed traitors had invaded the assembly. He ordered the guards to clear the hall, and they did. The legislature was dissolved. Power evaporated like breath on glass. By nightfall, France had no government. The next day, a new constitution was signed, the consulate was born. Napoleon would serve as first consul, with the others beneath him. There were no elections, no debates, just certainty. The people, weary of chaos, accepted it, and in the vacuum left by a broken republic, a single man stepped forward, young, composed, radiating the calm certainty of command. He spoke not of dictatorship, but of restoration, of order, of efficiency, and he delivered. Almost immediately, reform swept through France. He restructured the tax system, established the Bank of France, reopened schools, and offered amnesty to émigrés. He mended ties with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, giving France back a sense of spiritual rhythm without surrendering to clerical control. He rewrote the legal code, the Code of Napoleon, simplifying laws, granting civil rights, protecting property, and shaping a justice system that would outlive his empire. The code was modern, secular, and easy to apply. It placed him not just in command of armies, but in the hearts of institutions. For the first time in years, people could breathe. And yet, behind the laws and policies, the shadow thickened. Napoleon censored the press, shut down dozens of newspapers, appointed prefects to oversee regions with absolute authority. His ministers answered only to him. Dissent was tolerated only in whispers. The revolutionaries who had once cried for liberty now served a man who governed in silence. But he was efficient, and he brought results. In 1800, he led his troops across the Alps, a bold campaign that stunned Europe. His victory at the Battle of Marengo reasserted French dominance in Italy and crushed Austria's momentum. His army, lean and loyal, moved like a blade. France saw once more that he was not just a leader, he was the Republic's shield. He returned home to cheers. The Directory was gone. The Jacobins were quiet. The Royalists silenced. Only one name remained, chiseled into coins, stitched into uniforms, etched across Europe like a signature: Napoleon. In 1802, a national plebiscite confirmed him as first consul for life. The vote, though staged and controlled, gave the illusion of consent. He did not steal the republic. The people handed it to him. He accepted, not with humility, but with precision. He knew the moment was approaching. The charade would soon be over. In 1804, he made it official. The consulate was dissolved. An empire was declared. A crown was forged. And on December 2nd, inside the grandeur of Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of Pope Pius VII, Napoleon approached the altar. The Pope lifted the crown, but before he could place it on the general's head, Napoleon took it from his hands and crowned himself. The gesture was deliberate, blasphemous to some, divine to others. It said everything. He owed no one his throne, not the church, not the people, not the revolution. He was emperor not by lineage, but by will. And in that moment, the soldier who had returned from the desert, uninvited and untrusted, became the master of a continent, still unsure of how he had risen so far. But that was the secret. He hadn't waited for permission. He had seen the cracks and become the structure. It was December 2nd, 1804. Notre Dame Cathedral stood in breathless grandeur, dressed in crimson and gold, thick with incense and ceremony. Choirs whispered ancient hymns. Bishops hovered like ghosts in stiff robes. The Pope, seated at the center of the holy stage, waited to anoint the new ruler of France. But Napoleon Bonaparte did not wait. He turned, lifted the crown with his own hands, and placed it upon his own head. The gesture was small, but history shook. Kings are crowned, emperors too, but never by themselves. That moment, brief, deliberate, defiant, was more than symbolism. It was declaration. He was not a king of tradition. He was not a puppet of the church. He was not the child of the revolution. He was the architect of something new, and it answered to him alone. France stood stunned but obedient. Europe stood alert, and Napoleon, barely 35, stood at the pinnacle of his transformation. No longer the Corsican artillery officer, no longer the general of the people, no longer the consul restoring order. Now he was something else entirely, emperor of the French. And unlike monarchs of old, he didn't inherit a throne. He designed it. The coronation was equal parts myth and machinery. The throne was modeled after Charlemagne's. The eagle, symbol of the Caesars, returned to French banners. A new nobility was invented overnight. Dukes, counts, marshals, all loyal not to bloodlines but to him. The revolution had promised equality, but Napoleon offered something more potent: greatness by merit, not birth. And those who followed him were rewarded richly. Yet even as he reshaped France in gold and steel, he didn't abandon his deepest obsession: control. Within weeks, he expanded the police state. Dissent was crushed quietly. Spies walked among poets, painters, and professors. Censorship became law. Political prisoners vanished into silence. But to the public, there was calm. Food returned to markets. Crime dropped. Roads were repaired. Bridges built. Stability dressed itself in uniform. To many, Napoleon seemed not like a dictator, but like an answer. He wasn't just France's ruler. He was France's reflection, disciplined, proud, wounded, and ambitious. And beyond France, he turned to conquest. The crown had not satisfied him. It had merely marked a beginning. Austria and Britain refused to recognize the empire. Alliances formed. Armies moved. Napoleon responded not with diplomacy, but with strategy. In 1805, the War of the Third Coalition ignited. Austria, Russia, and Britain stood against France, and Europe braced for the return of a soldier who didn't forget. Napoleon struck fast. His masterpiece came at Austerlitz, a snowy plain in Moravia where three emperors' armies converged. Napoleon baited the Austro-Russian forces by pretending weakness, pulling his troops back from high ground. His enemies, thinking victory near, advanced with confidence. And then the trap closed. French troops emerged from the mist with precision. Cannons roared. The French right surged. The center collapsed, then flanked. By nightfall, over 30,000 enemy troops were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a triumph so total, so theatrical, that historians still call it the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon called it the finest moment of my life. His enemies called it a warning. Following Austerlitz, Austria surrendered. The Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year-old institution, was dissolved. Napoleon replaced it with the Confederation of the Rhine, placing German states under his protection. He redrew borders like a cartographer with absolute power. At home, the victories were celebrated like holidays. Streets were named for battles, medals minted, arches raised. The French saw their emperor not as a tyrant, but as a titan. The revolution had promised freedom, but Napoleon gave them victory, and the people, weary of uncertainty, chose glory over ideals. He returned to Paris not to rest, but to reform again. His legal system expanded. The Napoleonic Code, built on clarity and control, spread across Europe. In every territory he touched, he installed versions of French law, replaced feudal customs, and planted the seeds of secular government. Even his enemies would later preserve his reforms. Yet, within the palace, cracks appeared. Josephine, once the empress of his heart, could not give him an heir. Napoleon hesitated. He loved her, or perhaps he loved the version of himself that had once needed her. But now, with an empire rising and legacy at stake, emotion became inconvenience. In 1810, he divorced her, not with cruelty, but with calculation, and within months, he married Marie-Louise of Austria, a Habsburg princess, 19 years old. The message was clear. The revolution had once killed a king and queen. Now, its survivor had married into royalty. The cycle had reversed. The peasant's son had become Europe's sovereign. The following year, a son was born, Napoleon II, the King of the Rome. The empire, it seemed, had everything: peace, a successor, and unrivaled dominance. But shadows never sleep. Spain burned beneath guerrilla warfare. British ships ruled the seas. Russia waited, vast, cold, and patient. And Napoleon, drunk on control, began to mistake domination for destiny. The crown, once taken in defiance, now sat heavier. Every success brought new enemies. Every victory carved deeper expectations. The emperor who once moved through Europe like a whisper had become its storm, and storms, even when they win, always leave ruin behind. He once said, "A soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon, And for Napoleon, war was more than duty, it was language. A language he spoke with elegance and brutality, with geometry and blood. While monarchs negotiated, he moved columns. While kings wrote letters, he drew arrows across maps. And Europe, every inch of it, was listening. By 1807, Napoleon's empire stretched farther than any France had ever dreamed. From Lisbon to Warsaw, from the Rhine to the Adriatic, his reach was absolute. He installed his brothers on thrones, Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. Even his brother-in-law Murat rode into Naples wearing a crown. But none of them were Napoleon, and none of them knew the war like he did. War was his theater, his measure, his breath. And in 1808, the curtain rose again. It began with Spain, a land Napoleon thought would fall with the same ease as others. The Spanish king had abdicated. Napoleon installed Joseph as monarch, but the Spanish people did not bend, they bled. Guerrilla fighters, farmers, priests, students struck from hills and alleys. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't follow rules. They used knives, sabotage, and silence. French troops, unprepared for this kind of resistance, found themselves in a war that never slept. In Madrid, French officers were ambushed in the streets. Columns were swallowed in mountain passes. And then came the British, led by a commander as stubborn as he was skilled, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Spain became a quagmire, a slow bleed. The Grande Armée, so precise on open fields, found itself unraveling in shadows. But Napoleon did not stop. He turned east to Austria, again rising. In 1809, at the Battle of Wagram, he faced another massive Austrian force. The fighting was fierce. His enemies adapted. His marshals hesitated. Victory came, but it was harder now. Not a clean sweep, but a grinding assault that left both sides bloodied. After Wagram, he took Marie-Louise as his new bride. The marriage was part celebration, part signal. He was now allied by blood to the Habsburg dynasty, the same royal house that had once scorned France. And when his son, Napoleon II, was born in 1811, it seemed his legacy was secured. But power that grows too fast often feeds on itself. By now, his empire was more than territory, it was burden. Every victory required garrisons, taxes, reforms, loyalty. And Europe, quietly, had begun to resist not with armies, but with endurance. In Russia, that resistance was waiting. Napoleon believed that the Russian Tsar, Alexander III, had broken their alliance. He was right, partially. Trade tensions, mutual suspicion, and personal pride had eroded their treaty. But what he didn't understand was that Russia didn't need to win. It only needed to survive. In 1812, he marched with over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian soil. He called it the Second Polish War, but history would call it something else. Disaster. The Russians did not fight the way Napoleon expected. They retreated, always just ahead, burning villages, crops, and wells behind them. The French army moved deeper, starving. Horses died, shoes disintegrated, men collapsed. But Napoleon pushed forward. At Borodino, the Russians finally stood. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the era. Over 70,000 men fell in a single day. Napoleon won the field, but lost time, and Russia did not break. He entered Moscow, expecting surrender, finding smoke. The city had been abandoned, fires lit. The capital of Tsarist pride offered nothing but ash. He waited weeks for peace. It never came. Winter did. The retreat began in silence, then turned to horror. Snow-buried roads. Frost-bitten soldiers dropped their rifles. Starvation spread. Wolves circled camps. Russian cavalry harassed the rear. And Napoleon, once the master of motion, now moved at the mercy of ice. When the Grand Armée finally stumbled back across the border, only a fraction remained. Of the 600,000 who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 survived. Europe smelled weakness. The defeat shattered his myth. It was the first time the man who spoke in victories now spoke in absence, and in his absence, old enemies stirred. Prussia rearmed. Austria broke ranks. Sweden, Britain, Russia all formed a new coalition. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon faced the largest Allied army yet assembled. He fought fiercely, maneuvering with brilliance. But he was outnumbered, surrounded. The bridges collapsed. Men drowned in retreat. And now, for the first time, the war came to France. Paris trembled. Napoleon rushed back. He fought a brilliant campaign of defense. The 6 days campaign, winning battle after battle against larger forces. But it wasn't enough. On March 31st, 1814, Allied troops entered Paris. The Senate turned against him. His marshals lost faith. And in April, Napoleon did something he had never done before. He surrendered, not in battle, but in name. He abdicated the throne. He kissed his old guard farewell at Fontainebleau, eyes wet with disbelief. Then he boarded a carriage and left France, exiled to a small Mediterranean island few had ever thought about, Elba. But even there, even in defeat, he was not finished, because Napoleon Bonaparte had never spoken in silence. He spoke in return. For a man who had once ruled over 70 million souls, the island of Elba must have seemed impossibly small. It was mountainous, rural, and silent, a fragment of land floating off the Italian coast, gifted to him not as a favor, but as a cage. They called it exile. He called it a pause. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated, or so the world believed. It was April 1814. After a decade of warfare, Europe had crushed the French Emperor. The Allies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had marched into Paris. His marshals had refused to fight. His Senate had betrayed him, and in a final gesture of control, Napoleon abdicated the throne and agreed to leave France. But exile, in his case, came with unusual terms. He would be emperor still, of Elba, a tiny domain of 12,000 inhabitants. He would have his own flag, his own guard, and a small annual income. To his enemies, it was a way to save face. A soft exile for a man they feared might still inspire revolt if executed. To Napoleon, it was a playground, a quiet stage, a waiting room. He arrived on the island with a handful of loyal officers and quickly set to work, building roads, reforming local agriculture, establishing a miniature court. He held parades, dined with townspeople, issued proclamations. Some believed he was adjusting to civilian life. They were wrong. Napoleon was not adjusting. He was listening. From Elba, he received letters, smuggled news, whispers from France, where the restored Bourbon monarchy, led by King Louis XVIII, was stumbling. The French people, weary of war, had accepted the return of monarchy, but they hadn't asked for it. And the Bourbons, exiled for decades, seemed completely out of step with the France that Napoleon had forged. Taxes rose, veterans were ignored. The Napoleonic Code, that cornerstone of legal reform, was tampered with. The tricolor flag was gone, and slowly, so was patience. Officers muttered, soldiers grumbled. The people remembered not just the wars, but the roads, the food, the order. And Napoleon remembered them. He also knew this: the Allies were distracted. At the Congress of Vienna, Europe's leaders were busy redrawing borders, congratulating themselves, and arguing over who got what. They believed the Corsican had been filed away, a closed chapter, but they had forgotten one thing. Napoleon did not retire. On the evening of February 26, 1815, he slipped away with less than 1,100 men, one ship, and a daring plan. He set sail for France. The journey was risky. British ships patrolled the coast. A single interception could end it all, but the gods of wind and war remained silent and let him pass. On March 1st, he landed on the southern coast of France near Cannes. There was no army waiting, no fanfare. Just a man in uniform, returned from exile, walking toward Paris with a handful of veterans. But as he moved north, something extraordinary happened. The people began to come. First peasants, then veterans, then garrisons. Soldiers sent to arrest him listened to his words, then knelt. When he reached Grenoble, the local commander switched sides. The moment that cemented it all came days later, when Napoleon stood before a royal regiment, opened his coat and shouted, "If any among you would kill your emperor, Emperor, here I am." No bullets came. They cheered. By the time he reached Lyon, he was no longer a fugitive. He was once again a ruler. City after city opened its gates. Louis XVIII fled Paris in disguise, and on March 20th, just 3 weeks after landing, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace. No bloodshed, no coup, no vote, just return. It was one of the most stunning political reversals in history. One man, unarmed and exiled, had taken back an empire without a single battle. But the dream was already on borrowed time. The Allies, upon hearing the news, didn't hesitate. They declared Napoleon an outlaw. The truce was broken. Armies were summoned. Prussia, Britain, Austria, and Russia began to move, and thus began the 100 Days, a final chapter carved from defiance. Napoleon acted quickly. He promised peace, issued reforms, reaffirmed the Napoleonic Code. But he knew the storm was coming. Diplomacy would not stop it. Only battle could. He assembled an army, 200,000 strong, of veterans and volunteers, not the Grande Armée of old, but loyal men who believed he had been wronged. He had one chance: strike fast, divide the Allies before they fully united, and force a negotiated peace. And so, in June 1815, he marched to Belgium. His target, the Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under General Blücher. The clash that followed would not be one of politics or even strategy alone. It would be a reckoning, a judgment rendered in cannon fire and blood. The world had watched a man return from the edge of history. Now it would watch to see if he could stay. The field was quiet that morning, still, damp, and wide. A patch of earth in Belgium, known then as Mont Saint-Jean. It looked unremarkable, but by the time the sun would set on June 18th, 1815, this place would echo through history under one name: Waterloo. It was here that Napoleon Bonaparte would face the final test of vision, of leadership, of fate. The build-up had been fast. After reclaiming power in France during the 100 Days, Napoleon wasted no time. He knew the Allied powers were preparing to crush him again, this time with no mercy. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, they had learned from his past. There would be no exile, no soft landings. This time, if they won, it would be the end. So Napoleon made his move. His plan was characteristically bold. Invade Belgium, strike before the Allied armies could unite, and knock out the British and Prussians one at a time. Then, perhaps, Europe would negotiate. It nearly worked. On June 16th, he won a sharp victory at Ligny, defeating the Prussians under General Blücher. But they weren't crushed, only scattered. Napoleon believed they would retreat too far to rejoin the fight. He turned his attention west to Wellington. The Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, had chosen a strong defensive position just south of Brussels. He placed his troops behind ridges, anchored by two key farmhouses. Hougoumont on the right, and La Haye-Sainte in the center. He had roughly 68,000 men, British regulars, Dutch Belgians, Germans. A mixed but experienced force, and he had a reputation for caution, calculation, and holding ground under pressure. Napoleon arrived late on the 17th, his men exhausted and hungry. Rain had turned the roads into mud, delaying supply lines and artillery. He chose not to attack that night, hoping to give his troops rest and wait for drier ground. That decision, a delay of hours, may have changed everything, because the Prussians were coming back. As dawn broke on the 18th, both armies prepared. Napoleon had around 73,000 men, including elite Imperial Guard units and a formidable cavalry force. He was confident. He had won dozens of battles with fewer numbers and less favorable positions, and he believed Wellington would fold once the center broke. At 11:30 a.m., the cannons roared. The French attacked Hougoumont first, a stone farmhouse and walled compound on the Allied right. Napoleon meant it as a distraction, a probe. But Hougoumont would become a fortress of resistance. British guardsmen defended it with ferocity, repelling wave after wave. Napoleon poured in more troops, and still it held. Over 7,000 Frenchmen died trying to take it. The distraction had become a drain. Meanwhile, in the center, the main attack began. French columns moved toward the ridge, crossing soggy fields under British artillery fire. La Haye-Sainte, the farmhouse at the center of Wellington's line, became the focal point. Fierce fighting raged for hours. Napoleon's infantry pushed close. British skirmishers held, then fell back. The French took the farm, but not the ridge. Then, in the early afternoon, came the cavalry charges. Marshal Ney, believing the Allies were breaking, ordered repeated massed cavalry assaults against Wellington's lines. Without infantry or artillery support, thousands of horsemen galloped uphill toward the tightly formed British squares. The thunder of hooves, the clash of sabers, the blinding smoke of musket fire. It was chaos, but the squares held. Time and again, the French cavalry swarmed, and time and again they were repelled. Horses piled onto corpses, officers fell, and still Ney kept attacking, hoping for a crack, but none came. Napoleon, meanwhile, was distracted. Reports reached him. The Prussians were returning. Blücher, the 73-year-old Prussian commander, had rallied his troops after Ligny and marched fast, determined to keep his promise to Wellington. By late afternoon, Prussian forces arrived on Napoleon's right flank, first in small numbers, then in waves. The French were now fighting on two fronts. Napoleon dispatched troops to hold them off, but the tide had shifted. He ordered one final gamble. The Imperial Guard, his undefeated elite, were sent up the center toward Wellington's ridge. These men were veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. They had never broken. If anyone could win the day, it was them. They marched in silence, tall and steady, their bearskin hats towering above the smoke. The sight alone sent a chill through Allied lines. But as they crested the ridge, British troops rose from behind, muskets fired at point-blank range. The Guard hesitated, then reeled, then fell back. Wellington saw it and raised his hand. "Now, Maitland, now's your time," he shouted. British troops surged forward. Drums thundered. Flags waved. The Guard broke, and with it, the French line collapsed. Cries of "La Garde recule," the Guard is retreating, spread like panic. It was the first time the Imperial Guard had ever retreated in battle. Soldiers threw down weapons. Chaos erupted. The road south became a bottleneck of fleeing men, overturned carts, and discarded muskets. Napoleon watched it all from a hillside. The rain returned. Smoke hung in the air like a curtain. It was over. By nightfall, over 40,000 men lay dead or wounded. The fields of Waterloo were quiet again, but the world had changed. The next day, Napoleon fled. Paris received him coldly. His enemies were already approaching. He abdicated again, this time not to return. The man who had once crowned himself emperor was now an outlaw. In his own land, Europe had survived his thunder, but the silence that followed would never quite forget it. He had ruled Europe, redrawn borders, crowned kings, shattered empires. But now, Napoleon Bonaparte was reduced to a name on a list, a political problem to be locked away, far from history's center. No more Elba, no more games. This time, the Allies weren't taking any chances. On July 15th, 1815, less than a month after the collapse at Waterloo, Napoleon surrendered to the British aboard the HMS Bellerophon. He had hoped for exile in England, perhaps even a quiet life as a retired general, but Britain had other plans. This man had escaped once. He would not escape again. Their choice was brutal and final. St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass, harsh, wind-scoured, a place no one ruled, and from which no one could run. It was less a prison, more a forgotten corner of the world, and it would be his tomb. On October 15th, 1815, after a 10-week sea voyage, Napoleon stepped ashore for the last time. He was now 46 years old, gray at the temples, heavier but still standing straight. His entourage included a few loyal officers, a cook, a valet, and his personal doctor. They called him Emperor. The British called him General Bonaparte. The world called him Finished. His new home, Longwood House, a damp, mildew-ridden estate on a barren plateau surrounded by red earth and watchful sentries. Soldiers watched his every move. British ships circled the island. He could see the ocean from his window, but it was only a mirror of what he'd lost. For the first time in his life, Napoleon could not move the world, so he turned inward. At first, he tried to impose rhythm, rose early, rode on horseback, spoke of returning, of writing, of reshaping history through memory. He planted gardens, played cards, dictated memoirs to his aides. Every word he uttered was transcribed. Every memory turned to myth. He told the story his way. The boy from Corsica who had risen, not by birthright, but by brilliance. The general who brought justice to a crumbling republic. The emperor who had been betrayed, not defeated. He spoke of Egypt as if it had been a victory, of Moscow as a misstep, not a mistake, of Waterloo as an inevitability, not a collapse. His legends grew while his world shrank. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, treated him coldly, strictly enforcing rules, limiting contact, reducing comforts. The two men despised one another. Lowe saw a schemer, a manipulator. Napoleon saw a jailer with no honor. Their conflict became a ritual of stares, reports, and silences. He walked less, slept more, ate irregularly. His skin paled, his energy dimmed. Some said it was the climate, others, his restricted lifestyle. Some whispered poison, conspiracy, or a slow death plotted in silence. More likely, it was cancer, stomach like his father, inevitable, slow, and cruel. But even in decline, he shaped the room. Visitors who saw him remembered the aura, the weight of his gaze, the intelligence that flickered in every word, his memory, his precision, his analysis. Even as his body weakened, his mind refused to surrender. He spoke of Alexander, of Caesar, of Hannibal. He compared timelines, analyzed mistakes, weighed the cost of empires. He quoted poets, corrected maps, reenacted battles untabled with pins and stones. He was no longer fighting nations. He was fighting time. The last year were bitter. His friends argued. Some left, others died. France, now under Louis XVIII, had little interest in the man who had once ruled it. His letters were censored. His name was banned in schools. As months turned into years, his health began to fail. Yet, for all the stone, it was words that carried him further. His memoirs, dictated during exile, were published across Europe, translated, reprinted, dissected. They portrayed him not as a defeated general, but as a philosopher warrior, a man who had tried to save Europe from itself, a martyr of modernity. Of course, he had dictated every word. He had crafted his myth as carefully as he had commanded battles, and that myth endured. In 1851, his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, capitalized on the name, winning election as President of the French Republic. A year later, he staged a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. The dynasty returned, not through revolution, but through memory. Even today, his story remains alive. His face has appeared on more statues than most kings. His laws still echo in courtrooms. His name is stamped on boulevards, schools, and coins. More books have been written about Napoleon than nearly any other figure in history. He rivals Jesus and Shakespeare in volume. He exists in strategy games, novels, documentaries, memes, reborn in every generation's language. Because deep down, his story is not just about power. It's about the idea that one person, one flawed, brilliant, relentless human being could change everything. He once said, "Imagination rules the world," and perhaps more than any general before or after, he proved it. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man, the emperor, the exile, died on a rock in the Atlantic. But the myth marched on. History does not remember every ruler. Thrones are inherited and forgotten. Empires rise, then vanish into footnotes. But some names, rare and stubborn, carve themselves into stone, law, memory, and myth. Napoleon Bonaparte left behind more than battles. He left behind a blueprint, not just for France, but for modern power itself. When he died in 1821, he left no empire, no dynasty strong enough to survive, no living throne. But what he left behind was far more complicated, a legacy stitched into the DNA of Europe. Let's start with what you can still see. The Code Napoleon, written during his reign, still forms the foundation of legal systems, not only in France, but across Belgium, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and large parts of Latin America. It redefined law by removing feudal privilege and religious entanglement. The code established civil equality, secular courts, property rights, and the principle that the law applied to everyone, rich or poor, noble or not. Before Napoleon, laws were often oral, scattered, or controlled by aristocratic courts. After Napoleon, law became written, public, and universal. In administration, he revolutionized government. He organized departments, appointed prefects to enforce uniform policies, and created a centralized structure that could withstand change, a model still used by many modern states. Public education, once a privilege of the elite, was transformed under his rule into a standardized, secular system for future citizens and soldiers alike. Even infrastructure bore his mark. Roads expanded, bridges rose. Paris was modernized. He created the Bank of France, stabilized the currency, and organized taxation, turning a bankrupt post-revolutionary nation into the financial heart of continental Europe. He was, in many ways, a builder disguised as a conqueror, but war and the scale of it was also his legacy. Napoleon changed warfare as profoundly as he changed law. He pioneered modern military strategy, the use of core systems, fast mobility, integrated artillery, and aggressive offense. His campaigns are studied in military academies around the world, from West Point to Saint Cyr. His emphasis on merit over birth in the military led to generations of officers who rose through talent rather than title. He made armies, not extensions of kings, but of nations, for better or worse. His approach to mobilization showed the world that an entire country could be organized for war, an idea that would echo into both world wars. But perhaps the deepest imprint he left was not institutional, it was emotional, philosophical. Napoleon changed how people thought about leadership, destiny, and the self. Before him, Europe was ruled by bloodlines, ancient names that passed power from one generation to the next. Napoleon shattered that idea. He rose not from nobility, but from nowhere, a boy from a forgotten island, a general who outsmarted kings, an emperor who crowned himself. He embodied the Enlightenment dream of meritocracy, that greatness could be earned, that intelligence, courage, and will could overcome class, tradition, and prejudice. Even his enemies knew it. Tsar Alexander I of Russia once called him the greatest genius that ever lived and the most consummate scoundrel. His contradiction became his power. He was a revolutionary who crushed revolutions, a champion of reason who relied on superstition and symbols, a man of the people who ruled them absolutely. He left behind an empire of ideas. His actions sparked nationalism across Europe, even where he failed. In Germany, his invasions forced fractured states to consider unity. In Italy, he planted the early seeds of unification. In Spain, his occupation fueled resistance that would become independence movements in the colonies. In South America, leaders like Simón Bolívar drew inspiration from Napoleon's defiance and vision, imagining republics freed from kings and guided by justice. In art, in music, in literature, he haunted every genre. He was sketched, painted, composed into symphonies. He was the anti-hero, the romantic villain, the tragic genius. His presence bent the brush of painters like David, the pen of Hugo, the strings of Tchaikovsky, and to generations that followed, he became the impossible mirror. To Democrats, he was a warning, the revolution betrayed. To monarchists, he was a cautionary tale, the peasant who rose too high. To military men, he was the unreachable standard. To the oppressed, he was proof that a single mind could bend the world. Even his enemies' greatest achievements came in response to him. The Congress of Vienna, which shaped 19th century Europe, was designed entirely to prevent another Napoleon. The balance of power, the redrawing of borders, the suppression of liberal revolutions, all were echoes of the fear he left behind. But perhaps most fascinating is this: no one ever agreed on what he truly was. Hero, tyrant, visionary, usurper. The truth is, Napoleon refused to fit into anyone's shape, and that refusal became the most modern thing about him. He anticipated the world to come, a world where identity is constructed, where power is about image as much as action, where charisma can conquer faster than cavalry. He didn't just leave institutions. He left a formula: ambition plus intelligence plus myth equals movement. And once that formula was known, it could never be unknown. That is why his name still moves people. Because Napoleon did not just rule in his time, he invented a kind of timeless power, not bound to a crown, a flag, or even a nation, but to story, to the idea that one person, deeply flawed, intensely brilliant, terrifyingly human, could rise, burn, and echo through time, not because they were born to rule, but because they believed they could. The cannons had gone silent. The eagle standards had fallen. Napoleon Bonaparte was gone, not just from power, but from the world. Yet the silence he left behind was not peace, it was recalibration. Because when a man like Napoleon exits the stage, the play doesn't end. The actors shift, the scenery resets, but the audience never forgets the lead. The year was 1815. Napoleon had surrendered. Europe's leaders, exhausted from decades of war, gathered in Vienna to rebuild. But they weren't just reconstructing borders. They were rebuilding reality. The Congress of Vienna was history's great attempt at control. Diplomats and monarchs came from every major European power: Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain. Their mission was not to create justice, but to prevent another Napoleon, to stop another individual from ever shaking the world so completely. They redrew the map of Europe. Territories were shifted like chess pieces. Monarchies were restored. Old regimes returned to old thrones. France, now under King Louis XVIII, was forgiven, but placed under watchful eyes. And above all, the balance of power was enforced. No single country, they declared, should ever dominate the continent again. But here's the irony: Napoleon's shadow never left the room. Everything these leaders did, every treaty signed, every army deployed, every law passed, was shaped by the fear of what he had proven possible: that one man could rise from nothing, ignite nations, and rule by sheer will. They built walls, but the idea had already escaped. For the next half-century, Europe was gripped by a strange paradox. On the surface, it was a time of order, diplomacy, and kings. But beneath it, revolution brewed. In France, Napoleon became a memory too big to suppress. Though his dynasty had ended, his ideals had not. When King Louis XVIII died and was succeeded by Charles IX, a reactionary monarch, the public grew restless. In 1830, the July Revolution erupted. Barricades were raised, crowds marched, and once again the monarchy was replaced, not by a republic, but by a citizen king, Louis Philippe, who promised to rule in the spirit of the revolution. It was a compromise, but compromise never satisfies the memory of an empire. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, saw his chance. In 1848, another wave of revolutions swept Europe. In France, the monarchy fell again, and the Second Republic was born. Louis Napoleon ran for president, invoking his uncle's name, legacy, and legend. He won by a landslide, and 4 years later, just like his uncle, he dissolved the legislature, staged a coup, and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Europe watched in disbelief. Had history repeated itself? Not quite. Napoleon III lacked the genius of his uncle, but he understood the myth. He used photography, public works, and propaganda to build image. He modernized Paris, supported railways, and positioned France once again as a major player. Yet, even he could not control the legacy he'd inherited. In 1870, war with Prussia shattered his empire. He was captured, exiled, and his regime collapsed. France would never again see a Bonaparte on the throne. But by then, the world had already changed. Nationalism, once a spark Napoleon had fanned, now burned across continents. Italy, fragmented for centuries, began to unify under leaders inspired by his ideals. Germany, once a quilt of small states, unified under Prussian strength, and under the leadership of men who had studied Napoleon's campaigns. In Latin America, leaders like Bolivar and San Martin had drawn directly from his playbook, using military brilliance and populist language to break colonial chains. Even in the United States, where admiration for Napoleon had always existed, his model of meritocracy, military prestige, and law left an imprint. And in Russia, the Tsars, who had once trembled before his armies, adapted his reforms. They modernized their military, streamlined administration, and centralized power, in many ways mirroring what he had done. Napoleon had not just changed borders, he had rewired power. And so, even as the world moved forward into the steam age, the industrial boom, and the era of empires, his influence lingered in the structure of modern states, in the organization of armies, in the belief that one man could change history, not by birth, but by action. But the world without him also showed something else, that without Napoleon, Europe remained unstable. Wars still erupted, revolutions still burned, kings still fell. He had not created chaos, he had revealed it, exposed the old world's fragility, and filled its void for a time. But no system lasts forever. By the end of the 19th century, Europe had formed a complex web of alliances, a direct result of the fear his empire had once provoked. These alliances, though intended to preserve peace, would eventually become the trapdoors that led to World War I. And in the trenches of that war, generals still read Napoleon's manuals. His name still echoed across barracks. His bust still stood in officers' quarters, and his logic still shaped battles fought long after he died. The world without Napoleon didn't forget him. It tried to imitate him, tried to contain him, tried to outrun the very questions he had forced upon it. What is greatness? What is power? What is the price of ambition? And each time a leader rose with dreams too vast, comparisons returned. To the man who once stood alone atop Europe, crowned not by tradition, but by will. There are rulers who inherit kingdoms, others who seize them, a few who defend them, and then, once in a century, maybe less, comes someone who reshapes the very idea of what a kingdom is. Napoleon Bonaparte did not just govern an empire. He constructed one from intellect, fire, and will. And when it crumbled, it left not ruin, but a roadmap. So where does he sit in the vast theater of history? Among tyrants? Among visionaries? Among cautionary tales? The answer is yes, to all of them. Because Napoleon was not one thing. He was many things in rapid succession, and that's why he endures. He was born in 1769, a child of Corsica, at the edge of Europe and identity. By the time he died in 1821, the continent had been shattered and stitched back together by his ambition. In just 5 decades, he had moved from a provincial boyhood to imperial majesty to global myth, and that arc, so steep, so cinematic, is part of why we can't stop retelling it. Historians have debated him endlessly. Some see him as the final gasp of monarchy, others as the harbinger of the modern state. Some call him a monster, the cause of millions of deaths. Others, a reformer who ended feudalism, spread civil rights, and transformed the law across continents. But perhaps the real answer lies in how we still use his name. To this day, when someone rises too fast, they are called Napoleonic. When someone rules too tightly, they are warned of the emperor's fate. When someone dreams too big, they are asked if they've read Waterloo. He has become a reference point, a symbol not just of power, but of its volatility, and his life forces a question we still ask. Can greatness and goodness exist in the same body? Because Napoleon was great, there's no denying it. His military genius, legal reforms, political instincts, they were unmatched in his time. He could outthink generals, outmaneuver politicians, out-inspire armies. He created systems that still govern people today. But was he good? That answer is harder. He censored speech, crowned himself, waged wars that left villages in ash and rivers red. He used people as tools, loved them as symbols. He valued loyalty, yes, but only if it bowed to his mission. And yet, his soldiers wept when he fell. His people welcomed his return. Even his enemies, after defeating him, studied him. What does that say? It says that Napoleon did not fit into the molds his time had made. He was neither enlightenment nor monarchy, neither democracy nor despotism. He was Napoleonism, a unique brand of power forged from personal will and national momentum. And in many ways, the world has never stopped trying to understand it. He didn't just change law, he changed language. He didn't just redraw maps, he redrew what was possible. He turned military victory into political power, myth into momentum, silence into structure, and most importantly, he made ambition visible. To every young officer dreaming beyond his rank, to every outsider imagining a seat at the table, to every nation, wondering if it could redefine itself. He became a symbol of becoming. That's why his story still matters, not because of what he won, but because of what he represented. The idea that the world could be changed by the will of one relentless mind. But history, like empires, is complex. It remembers both the builder and the breaker. It echoes both the applause and the cannon fire. It tells us that even the brightest star can burn too hot and fall, and yet when it falls, it still lights the sky. Napoleon's place in time is not just in the 1800s. It's in every era that struggles with power, every generation that asks how much one person should shape the many, every moment when ideals crash into ambition and leave behind a paradox. That's what he was, a walking paradox, a general who crowned himself emperor, a man who promised liberty, then ruled by decree, a product of the Enlightenment, who mastered the shadows, and perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still walk his road, because Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a man of his time, he was a man ahead of it, and we're still catching up.